So maybe I should just begin by where we left off in the previous, with these couple of verses here. We often in the Seventh-day Adventist Church use a shorthand designation for the writings of Ellen White, and we call it what? The Spirit of Prophecy. And that's not totally accurate. So we should probably emphasize this a little bit. The Spirit of Prophecy is the Holy Spirit who inspires the prophets. All prophets. And what do they talk about? It's the testimony of Jesus. So it's a message from Jesus. So when we refer to the Spirit of Prophecy, we're saying one example. In this current last day church, God gave the gift of prophecy to communicate to his church to prepare a people for Christ's return. And what we want to look at today is to lay aside maybe the theological background and the historical background, which we've already described to some extent. And we just want to ask the question of what is the practical gift of these writings? What value is it to you and I today? I mean, she lived in a whole different era. It was a time of horse and buggy. It was a time without electricity. It was a time that we didn't have the complications. You know, if you wanted to move across the country, you didn't have to think about insurance and vehicle maintenance and all of that kind of stuff. You just loaded everything up in a Conestoga wagon and crossed the country, or took a railroad, took the train to go. And the train was the big way before the interstates. So what's the practical nature of it for us today? So a lot of different writings that she has written that leave us a legacy. Right here, I've just laid some out, and we talked a little bit about the overlapping nature of some of these writings. In fact, the truth is, Ellen White was much of a rewriter as a writer, because when she would write on one subject, she would continue writing on it through the rest of her ministry and duplicating it over and over again. The book that I just gave a little promo for is about her first two books. And if you have a book entitled Early Writings, you have 2/3 of the core part of that book, because Early Writings is 3 books in one. Early Writings is her sketches, the supplement, and Spiritual Gifts, Volume 1. And there's some question here that many have about her ministry and why Seventh-day Adventists put so much of an emphasis on it. I mean, after all, isn't our message about Jesus and not about the person? Well, I think there's something valuable in understanding about a person, because if a person delivers a message and the person's a scoundrel, it kind of calls into question what they have to say. But if the person is someone that you have respect for, a person whose life is consistent with what they teach, then there's an extra weight that goes into what they're saying. So in the first book that she wrote, she gives a little window on her experience that gives people a chance to know something about her. And then to say, okay, well, there's some value there. And I have in the book, this is another part of the book, I have in the book a number of responses to her. And the first category of people that responded were people that were skeptics at first. It's okay to be skeptical. It's all okay to wonder about some things and check things out first. One of the people that checked her out was a man named Heman Gurney. He was a blacksmith. And he heard people talking about this lady that was having visions. And he heard her present her first vision. And he said, I wonder what kind of a person she is. So he made the effort to go all the way from Boston to Portland, Maine, where her family was, and to talk to her family, her brothers, sisters, her mom and dad, people that she associated with. And the more he talked with those people, the more impressed he was that she was the real thing. She was genuine. And then he went back, and he was one of the first ones to publish some of her visions for other people to read. So we have different books that in the course of her having visions, we talked about the fact that she had a vision, the only one that she had in 1844, when she began sharing that vision, which was a hopeful message, an encouraging message to little bands of Adventists that were scattered about New England and a little bit further beyond. But in 1845, she began to have other visions. And as Jeff mentioned, I've been able to correlate and make a listing of all those visions. Believe it or not, the first time that it said, I've done it. It's been done. We just appreciated the messages, but nobody's went through. And as I make this list, I discovered that maybe only a third or less of all those visions were published. Some of them were never published. We have evidence of it. Somebody would talk about what she said, or that they were present the day when she had it, or she would describe that she had shared a message with somebody, but we don't have the contents of it. Why? Because it was for an individual, not for everybody. So the ones that are published in the book are the ones that they felt would have general interest for more people. Hence they publish it. Gathering it largely from articles that a little bit by little bit that they put together and included in published form. Now, I put these images up here. These are some of my favorite images. I worked on them with editing software to make them look sharp and accurate and so on. But what's the common theme in both of those pictures? Prayer. Yeah. Ellen Harmon and Ellen White was a woman of prayer. I think sometimes we misunderstand that, overlook that she prayed so very much. I'm going to share one person who was an eyewitness actually tells us about a prayer that he witnessed that she prayed. We'll probably video clip of that this afternoon, so I'm sure to come back to that or stay by for that. But prayer, she had a living experience with Jesus. She knew what it was to pray. She understood that prayer is not just, okay, I offer up an issue to God and, carte blanche, she's going to answer everything immediately and we have responses. She knew that prayer sometimes would be something that you'd have to pray about for weeks, maybe even years. Particularly when you're talking about people that you care about. Because when God works in people's lives, it takes time. Because people, they don't just have one little switch in your brain, You got to set the pace and you got to prepare the way and God has to work in their lives in a way so that they get the lights on and they see the truth and they recognize that they need God. And so there are people in your life that you've been praying for months and even years. People that you care about. She understood that. And she was a person of prayer. But one of the things that I discovered when I made the chart, and James White, her husband, called that to our attention, was that many of her visions came right in the middle of prayer while she was praying. And sometimes in that vision was an answer to something that they were searching for at the moment. And sometimes it was something that took them beyond what they were even dealing with. And they would just recognize that God was at work. So, prayer. All right. So, let's start getting into specifics. I told you, this is going to be the one that we're going to talk about. Ellen White's books are practical in a way that helps us as Christians. And the book Steps to Christ, how many of you have a copy of Steps to Christ? Okay, now raise your other hand if you've read it. Okay, good. Right. Steps to Christ, surprisingly, is a compilation. You heard the word compilation. It's a compilation of Ellen White's writings that describe the Christian experience. Talking about prayer, the importance of prayer. Talking about consecration. Looking at the Christian life. This is very practical for people. And for beginners, it might be even a little bit tough to understand. When I was studying to be baptized, I was 8.5 years old. I wanted to follow Jesus. I wanted to do what Jesus did. I remember my baptism, the day of my baptism. It was very special to me. But my understanding as a child was limited. So I read about these things, and I didn't understand it. All I knew was that I was following Jesus. And when I came out, I just remembered how that when Jesus was baptized, he came up on the bank, and what happened? The dove came fluttering down, landed upon him as representative of the Holy Spirit, landing upon him. And a voice from heaven spoke and said, "This is my beloved Son." And I didn't have that experience. But I had a quiet little moment afterwards. I came out, remember my hair was still wet, and I was just walking outside the church just by myself, and I just wanted to experience it by myself. And one of the ladies in the church said, "God bless you, son." I said, "Thank you." I remember that experience. But I didn't fully understand these things because it takes some time for you to understand about what it is to walk with Jesus. Steps to Christ is not the steps that get you to Jesus. It's the steps that Jesus takes with you. And so my favorite chapter in the whole book is the privilege of prayer. You think about that. You think about that. I had an occasion when I was visiting with my family down in Florida. That's where I came from originally, and we were down there with my brother and his wife, my wife, and actually I don't think my wife was with me that time. But my brother came, and we invited him to pray with us. Now, that's a unique thing because my brother counted himself an atheist. But we invited him to join us for prayer. And he wanted to pray. And my brother began his prayer. God of the universe. I'll never forget those words. The words of an atheist. How did he address God? And how glibly, sometimes when we pray, we forget who we're talking to. And we're were used to saying certain things in prayer, but he had this awareness that if he was talking to God, it was the God of the universe. What a privilege we have to be able to do that. How many of you do FaceTime on an iPhone? Anybody here? FaceTime, okay? Or Zoom? How many have ever done a Zoom session? Or maybe Facebook chat or some other thing? A few years ago we didn't do that, did we? Your phone, you have to kind of imagine the person's face, and as you're talking, you kind of picture things. That's all the best you have. But now we can do face to face. And back in the day, I don't think it was which one we used, but my daughter went to Taiwan with some friends. She was there every day with totally bizarre experiences. Because you go to a different country and the culture and the customs are also very different. And she was with some people and surrounded by Taiwanese or Chinese all the time, except for the friends that she was with. So it was her lifeline to call home, and she and my daughter would be talking like in the middle, our next daughter would be talking in the middle of the night, and I could hear them in the other room. And it was like they were just right next to each other. The clarity of that call over a phone, at the time. It was just so amazing. And I think about the privilege of prayer. That we're down here, and without a device, we're talking to the God of the universe. And he hears us. And not only does he hear us, but Romans says that his Holy Spirit speaks for us in groanings that cannot even be uttered. So it's translated. And as pitiful as our prayers are, it's a whole lot more eloquent by the time it gets to Jesus. So the privilege of prayer. That's one of the practical things in her writings. And this is a study that I'd like to get into even more as I began to look at these stories in her early life and what things she prayed for, and things that got immediate responses and sometimes things that took some time and that they were constantly in prayer. It's this whole attitude of prayer that she understood what it was to talk to God. You'll get this even more when we get the clip in the audio so you can hear how she prayed. And so Steps to Christ is not a book of theory, a book of theology. It's a book of the practicality of trusting in God and working with Him and committing our lives to Him and seeing what He does through us in how we share with others. So that's it. Steps to Christ. Did I say it was a compilation? Yeah. Well, so is the ministry of Eli. I didn't discover this book as the first book that I read. This wasn't the first book I read, but when I read it, I was amazed because by the time I had read it, I had also read another book, The Desire of Ages. And this book, which I thought was just going to teach me about health, is actually about Jesus. It starts off talking about how that He ministered to other people. And it's just a very powerful, condensed Desire of Ages, you might say. But it lays out the most fundamental of principles of health that if we follow, we're going to enjoy the benefits of it. Now, as you might imagine, when you get on the internet and you talk about Ellen White, you get your ears boxed quite a bit. There are people that aim for her, and they got some negative attitudes, and they got some nits to pick, and flaws to pick about her to try to make them feel better or to change my mind or whatever. And so I get into this with a lot of people. In particular, they're a little bit out of shape that she talks about health, because there's an implication that if you talk about health, you'll remind people that they're not being healthy. Right. And she's not giving it, and that's why I love this book after I discovered it. I've got another book that talks more about diet. You probably heard it counts on diet foods. But this book does talk about diet, but it also talks about the whole holistic view of health. And so I was talking with one of these folks, and they were, kind of talking down about how Ellen White was picking on people's diet and whatever. And I said, well, I found some real great practical value here. Because my dad's folks are from Louisiana. Now, that's how they say it in Louisiana. They don't say Louisiana. It's Louisiana, at least down where my folks are from. If you go up in northern Louisiana, they do say Louisiana. But anyway, Louisiana, down in Cajun country, where if it moves, you can eat it. I went to my dad's refrigerator one time, and I saw some mystery meat in there, and I said, Dad, what's that? He said, that's gator tail, son. So, that was the background for my daddy's side. And we used to get letters from my grandmother. And to use a euphemism, a lot of her letters were what they would call organ recitals. Because this organ was probably having troubles, and this other organ is trouble, and Aunt so-and-so was suffering with this, and Uncle so-and-so was suffering from that. And so much of the letter was about how the folks in Louisiana were suffering for health in the 50s and 60s. And I said, following the simple rules that I got from this lady, I skipped all that. My grandmother, in her 60s, that's the earliest I remember her. She was younger than I am now. That's a kick in the head. But when I remember my grandmother, she used to have this little bottle that the doctor gave her because she was having angina. It was a little bottle of natural glycerin pills. And I remember it because sometimes she would use that to get us kids to settle down in the back of the car. She said, kids, if you don't settle down, I'm going to have to take one of these nitroglycerin pills. And all I knew about nitroglycerin is that they used to blow up bridges. I said, oh, Grandma, don't do that. Be quiet. But she had those just in case. It's supposed to expand your blood vessel just a little bit so that if you get that little bit of a heart twinge. Well, she started thinking about that. She was having heart troubles, but she discovered, she said, she's just a practical lady. She said, if what's causing my heart to block up is blood fats, then maybe if I don't take in blood fats, I can reverse that. So she ate pretty simply to start with, but she cut out the little meatloaves that she used to have and the chicken. She ate maybe Thanksgiving turkey a little bit, but basically she became a vegetarian, ate lots of vegetables and brown rice, and I'd share a meal with her. It was a little simple meal, and she'd go out and she would walk every day. And at 5 foot tall, she could keep up with me walking. And she kept that little bottle of nitroglycerin pills in her pocket to remind her where she could have been. It was this healthy message. It turned things around for her. And it did for me. And, after I shared that with the person online, they didn't rag on me anymore. So that's a practical benefit. And if we learn more from that, and as you heard in the introduction, I actually went and studied about health principles at UG Pines Institute. And I learned there about hydrotherapy. And my goodness, how we have used hydrotherapy in my home. Just simple ways. So I don't have to run to the doctor every so often about things. We can pretty much take it in control. And then there have been a couple of times, I've had to get a consult with the doctor. But it was kind of like, he said, well, what do you think? That was kind of funny. Went with my son with an earache. You know how it is with kids. They get earaches often. And he had this one earache. And because I had been at UG Pines, I had one of those little otoscopes that you can look into the ear and see in there. Wasn't a very powerful one, but from what I could see, there was something in his ear. And it wasn't, usually, 9 times out of 10, it's behind the eardrum. But this time it wasn't. And I went to the doctor, and the first person said, yeah, sure enough, it's an eardrum problem. And I said, no, that wasn't what I saw. So he called in and consulted with another doctor and said, well, what do you see? And I said, well, it looks like a maypop. Any of you use that expression? Maypop? It's a little plant. What's the word for it? Anyway, it looks like it had little strings and stuff on it and everything. Anyway, and he said, yeah, that's what I'm saying too. He said, well, what do you think we ought to do? I said, I was thinking we could do a lavage. See, I learned some of those big words that you find. It just means wash it out. And he said, yeah, we could do that. So we washed it out, and took care of it. And he said, now, I want you to make sure he takes these antibiotics. And I said, well, I think we're taking care of the problem. He said, well, I'll make a deal with you. If he doesn't get better, will you get him the antibiotics? It's not that I'm against using antibiotics. We've used them different times, but I didn't think we need them. I said, deal. But you know what? Didn't have any more trouble. And that I learned about hydrotherapy. We learned just wash it out and dry it out with a little bit of alcohol afterwards, and learned about when the kids have infections in their lungs, and we can put them in hot water and keep them in a nice little warm bath, and then cool them off a little bit afterwards and let them rest for a while, and all kinds of things that came from this message about the use of water, sunshine, fresh air, exercise, and trust in God. One of my most favorite experiences was with my dad, my Cajun dad. He was having a bit of arthritis in his knees. He had injured it a few times, and it was really stiff. And I said, Dad, I know something that I could use for that. Would you mind if I gave you hydrotherapy treatment you need? It's just hot and cold pads that you put on the knees. Mostly warm, a little bit cold in between, about 3 times. And so I said, would you be open to that? He was. So I said, yeah, son, go ahead. And so I heated them all up, and I knelt down there before I was going to do it. And I said, Dad, before we do these treatments, we always pray. Because it's God who brings the healing. He said, okay, son, put your hands on. So I did. Put my hand on his knee. And so it was the most position of honor for me to be at my dad's knees, taking care of him and helping him with this. And so giving the hydrotherapy. And it opens up the blood vessels and the circulation, and it felt a whole lot better. All that comes from this ministry of healing. And an acronym: nutrition, exercise, water, sunshine, temperance, air, rest, trust in God. Hey, somebody knows what's up. All that came from this book. That's pretty practical. I mean, how many times do you get sick? How many times do you need to run to the doctor? How many times do you need that in your life and for your kids? And then another book, education. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about how these books were put together. This is just a little sideline here. A lot of people that have never written a book think that you write a book by just sitting down and writing from A to Z. But if you've written a book, you know that it rarely comes that way. I have a friend who writes stories about his lives. She says, yeah, I write from A to Z. But everybody else that I've talked to, they said, no, it doesn't go that way. It's a little piece this, a little piece that, then you arrange it, then you fill in, take all the pieces together, and then you have this thing that looks like, well, have you ever seen one of those cars that's been beat up? You got a fender and a hood in different colors, because they've been in an accident and they got spare parts put in, then they take it to the pay people and then you never know. It was made up of different vehicles. Well, that's how these books are when you put them together. They all look like they were just written from A to Z, but they're coming from different pieces. And Ellen White had a young lady who worked with her. She called her Marion. Her technical name was actually Marianne, but Marion stuck. Marion Davis, it's on her gravestone. Marion Davis helped her put together this book, Ministry of Healing, from her different writings, different sources. This book, Education, was put together by another lady from Ellen White's writings, whose name was Sarah Peck. She was an educator. But that book, Education, we used it as a textbook when I was studying at college, at Southern Missionary College, then Southern Missionary College. Book Education, beautiful book on education. I like to book because not only is it about looking at education as a means of a ticket to get a job when you get through school. That's generally what we think of higher education, right? You go through the motions, get the degree, and then you go get a job somewhere. But no, she was talking about education in a different sense, about practical nature of life and what you learn from life. There's some people that don't have higher education that are better educated than people that have higher education. Amen. Because they learn from life. And she wanted us to understand education. So this book is very practical. It even has a section in there on gardening. Anybody here like to garden? Got you. My wife's just discovered gardening. It is her salvation. With the craziness of the world, you're talking about Jonathan, she says, I go out there in my garden and everything's peaceful there. Although there are bugs. But education is about the whole life of a child and not just preparing them for this world, but for the world to come. And so that's very practical, that book, Education. I want to talk to you about this series. And it's more than just one series. You see these books side by side, two different height, because the first, let's go Hebrew, go from the right to the left, or for you, the right to the left. Those little books, I don't think she really had a plan before she started writing them, because they talk about different subjects. Spiritual gifts, those are two little volumes. It's volume 1 and 2, volume 3 and 4. But the first book that she wrote out is the third book, as we were talking, Terry, in early writings. Okay, there's those first two books that were mostly visions, some a little bit of autobiography, and then she had this other powerful vision in 1858. She had been called. They were traveling through Ohio, so the expansion of the movement by 1858. They're out west in Ohio, and they were visiting a little place called Levitt's Grove, and were meeting in a schoolhouse. And sadly, a little boy just found out who the boy was. They didn't mention his name. I think his name was John. Had passed away, and they were having a funeral. So people gathered together in a little crowded church, not like this. The churches were kind of tiny. And they didn't open up the windows to have a little ventilation because it got pretty easy in there. And they were having this celebration of the life of a child, comforting a young couple, that had lost a baby. And of all places, that went off into vision. And people recognized what it was because James said, this is a vision. They had seen it many times before, as the eyewitnesses in my book will tell you. And so they gave me time as she was off in vision. Some of them went on to the burial site and others stayed behind. And she told what she saw in vision. Now, some of her visions were omnibus. You heard that word, omnibus tending? Well, this was an omnibus vision. It had a little of this, a little of that, a little of the other thing. But the main thing it had in it was what we call the Great Controversy vision. And that Great Controversy vision tells us where all of the mess that we know of this planet began and why it began and who's involved and how Jesus is going to fix it. It's a great controversy. The great controversy between Christ and his angels and Satan and his angel. But you know who's going to win, right? And so she wrote that out in that book, in Great Controversy. That was the first title, but we call it Spiritual Gifts because then she wrote another one, another one. And that book thing was kind of the framework for them expanding that story in a series that is called The Spirit of Prophecy. The next book that you see up there. And she expanded it, not all just from visions, but some from history, some from the Bible, so that you can tell the full story of how that sin began, how it continued through, how God chose a people, how he brought his son to this world, how he raised up a church and carried that church through history, and then finally, how it will end. But the last words, it talks about sin and sinners are no more. That's what we want to get to. That's what God wants to get to. And the whole course of that journey is what we call the Great Controversy. And it was the Great Controversy in that big old book, Triumph of God's Love, quite well named, I would say, that my mom read. It made sense to her of all that she had studied in college. She had a master's in social work, and she had studied under a little professor who talked about Constantine marching his troops through a body of water and saying, now you're baptized, and how Constantine had been shown this vision of the cross and above the sun, and with the words, in this you will conquer. She had heard those stories, but now the Great Controversy made sense of it. And all the wars, the counter wars that took place in human history that just seemed like a mess, it gave her a view of human history that told her that God was still at work. That's what the Great Controversy tells us. That's very practical. Because when you're going through it in the middle of the day and going through it over the course of your life and things don't seem to be going right, the Great Controversy says, God's still at work. God's still there. He's working through all those circumstances in your life, just as he has done in history, and he's going to take you through to the time when sin and sinners are no more. So, it expanded to the Great Controversy. And the first series, which were not even published during her lifetime. Did you know that? That set of books, the Conflict of the Ages series. You know which one was the first one that was published? There's a little pop quiz here. What was the first one that was published in the Conflict of the Ages series? Anybody got a guess? The Controversy, yeah. That was the first one. Published as an expansion of the fourth volume of Spirit of Prophecy, and it was called The Great Controversy, and published alone. She expanded it in 1888, so that's the first one that gets its nearly final form. Okay, now this is not on the screen, so you got no cheese here. What was the second one she published? It's the bookend. Okay, Great Controversy is the end. What's the first one? Patriarchs and Prophets, 1890. So she's got the bookends, right? The conflict is here. So one is published 1888, one's published 1890. All right, I heard the next one. Desire of Ages is the middle one. Yeah, that's the climax. That's the most important part. That's where Jesus comes in this story, right? And it's the reworking of two volumes, volume 2 and 3 of Spirit of Prophecy, and of parts of spiritual gifts. The first one. So she kept writing about Jesus. She wrote about Jesus all the time. She wrote about Jesus from the beginning. She told about his life. She told about his ministry. She told about how he worked with people, how he dealt with difficult people. And she would use that in letters to people. And so some of those little pieces of letters where she was counseling Brother Corliss or her son or some other minister about how to deal with difficult people, Marion Davis would take that little snippet thing and say, oh, you really said it right that way. So she'd take that and she worked it into the Desire of Ages. So it got into there. So that's the middle book. Okay, what's the next one? Anybody know? No? You would think. Because the order it comes. Acts of the Apostles. Yeah, she had written on that in the 1880s. She enhanced it, finally got around to it, and it was finished in 1911. Okay. That's 4 years before she died. So the last one, Prophets and Kings, was not published until the year after she died. Yeah. Until it anyway. So that's the story that gave meaning to my mom's life, to much of our lives. Okay, that's the cover of my book. Okay. I just got this back as proof. And the reason I put this in there is because of the title of the book and what it's about. It's about glory. She says, I wish that I could speak in the language of heaven, because I would tell you of the things that I've seen. You know, that old hymn that we sing that's a patriotic hymn. Mine eyes have seen the glory. Her eyes saw the glory. And she shared a little bit of it, even as simply as she did it in her first books. So glory, glory, glory is a good way to describe what she saw. And those glimpses of glory are inspiring, because sometimes things are pretty dark. And of course, when she came back out of a vision, that's how she described it. She said, dark, dark. But when she'd go into vision, she'd say, glory, glory, glory. Because she was going to see beautiful things of what God has in store for his people. Glory. We need a little bit of glory, don't you? Don't we? We need that. That's our topic for this afternoon.